Simon Wigley. I'm the chair of the philosophy department. As you may have noticed, this event is co-organised with neuroscience and the Department of Psychology as well, which is sort of part of a project that we've had, or an enterprise that we've had ongoing for 2.5 to 3 years now, trying to build interdisciplinary research and work between the three disciplines. And this is one of the events we've organised. We've also had a prior event on social cognition. So this is kind of our second major international conference. And you know, when Tufan proposed or suggested the idea of building around imagination, it was such a perfect fit that we just sort of jumped on it. And unfortunately for him, it was such a great idea. He's ended up doing all the heavy lifting, as people have noticed. So we'll thank him at the end, but I just want to, preemptively thank him immensely for all the effort he's put in and is still putting in for this event. Apart from that, just quickly, welcome again, and I hope it's a great conference.
Good morning and welcome. So I am Tufan, and I will say a couple of things before we begin about the logistics of the whole thing. So first of all, the talks will be 40 minutes, at most 40 minutes, and then there will be a commentator responding to the talk for around 5 minutes, and then we will have a Q&A session. And in total, for each speaker, we have 1 hour, and then we will have a 10-minute break, as you can see from the program, which you can find online and also on the table when you come in. We will signal the times for the speakers, 10 minutes, 5 minutes, and we will keep the time very strictly, we have to. If you have any questions during the talk, so please wait until the Q&A session, and then during the Q&A session you can ask your questions. And if you don't have the opportunity to ask your question during the session, we will have a poster session at the end, right, on Saturday, tomorrow. So during the poster session, all the speakers will be there, so you will have the opportunity to talk. All right, now, when we introduce our speakers, we will not read all the biography thing. It is already in the handout program and the speaker biography, so you can find it there. It's also online in Philosophy Department's webpage, you can see it there. So, our first speaker is Margot Strohminger. She is a Marie Curie Fellow at Oxford University's Faculty of Philosophy and Junior Research Fellow, St. Cross College. So, the title of her talk is Supposition, Imagination, and Offline Belief.
Great. Thanks, Tufan, for organizing this, and yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing what you all have to say about a project I have on offline belief. So in this talk, I'm going to talk a bit about supposition, imagination, and offline belief, how these attitudes are related. Okay, so here's what I want to do today. First, I'm going to examine the roles of supposition and imagination in epistemological theorizing about conditionals and modality. Right? So how do we get knowledge of conditional statements, claims about possibility and necessity? And these views are traditionally formulated using these propositional attitudes, supposition and imagination. And then I'm going to argue that both roles can be played by an attitude that I'm calling offline belief. And then I'll argue that we should prefer an account that does without supposition and imagination and uses offline belief instead. Okay, so here's the plan of the talk. First, I'm going to start by talking about these standard contrasts that get drawn between supposition and imagination in a range of debates. Basically, whenever imagination is brought up, it's thought to be different from supposition, and some brief remarks are given about why they're different. Then I'm going to introduce offline belief. I'm going to give you a sketch of an account of what that is. And then I will move on to looking at attempts to characterize how we get knowledge of conditionals and knowledge of modality, and I'll tell you about how this gets formulated in terms of supposition and imagination, and then I'll tell you about how you can do it instead just by using offline belief. And then at the end, I'll tell you why I think we should prefer this alternative that just uses offline belief. Okay. So, the standard view among philosophers of imagination is that imagination is different from supposition. And I just want to say here that I'm going to focus on propositional imagination. You might think that there's a kind of objectual imagination that's not reducible to propositional imagination, right? So if I tell you, okay, imagine an empty highway, that actually is different from imagining that you're on an empty highway or imagining that there is an empty highway. And it can be formulated as an attitude towards a proposition. Setting that aside. Okay. And then when we look at even propositional imagination, we find that there's supposed to be this contrast with this other propositional attitude of supposition. And I think the most widespread view that you find is that supposition is not a kind of imagination at all, right? So you can suppose the P without imagining that P, this sort of view. And another view you find, to a lesser extent, I think, is that supposition is a kind of imagination, but it's very different from other types of imagination, right? So if you suppose the P, you thereby imagine the P. Okay, so what are some reasons for thinking that this first view is correct? Well, one consideration is that you're supposed to be able to suppose that P for the sake of argument without imagining the P, right? So you suppose that the square root of 2 is rational for the sake of argument or for the sake of reductio, and that doesn't involve imagining the P. Second, imagining that P is somehow more demanding than supposing that P, and that P gets spelled out in different ways. Perhaps it's phenomenologically richer. Third, success at supposition is more or less guaranteed, whereas it isn't for imagination. So, there's this very, among philosophers of art and aesthetics, it's claimed that there's a phenomenon of imaginative resistance. So when you're engaging in a work of fiction, sometimes you just, try as hard as you like. You're not able to go along with an invitation to imagine something. But it seems that in the same context, you are able to suppose the same claim to be the case. Okay. And then finally, there are supposed to be propositions that can't be imagined or can only be imagined with great difficulty, but they can easily be supposed, right? So you might think like latent contradictions or like that, or certain kinds of impossible propositions. And what about the second sort of view? I think here the terminology is just being used differently. And so what we see is that there's supposed to be a contrast between supposition and this more full-blooded, demanding kind of imagination. So you can kind of recover all of the contrast it was just noting in favor of the first view. So the idea is something like, for example, that success at supposition is more or less guaranteed, but it isn't for other kinds of imagination. And so, it should be no surprise that when we turn to discussions of imagination in epistemology, we see that it gets assigned a very different role from supposition, right? So we think, okay, well, whatever roles are being played by imagination today and supposition, it would be surprising if that could be played, I think, by one and the same propositional attitude. But nevertheless, that's what I'm going to argue. And I'm going to focus specifically on conditional statements and claims about metaphysical mortality, simply because you just find the most developed accounts of the roles of supposition and imagination in epistemology in those areas. Okay. So now I'm going to say a bit about offline belief, this attitude that I'm interested in using for theorizing about knowledge instead. So the metaphors that get used in the literature, there are a couple of them. One uses this term of simulation. So the idea is that there are kinds of mental state that simulate other kinds of mental state, right? And so you can think of the states that do the simulating as the offline analogs of their online counterparts, right? And then there's a controversial issue here about which mental states can be simulated. And I think it's fair to say that, I guess it's, belief is one of the most, it's widely thought that belief can be simulated, and that's all I'm going to be relying on here. But I think it also is another standard example that gets used for something like visual experience or other sensory experiences. You can simulate those, and that's what we're talking about when we talk about visualizing, for example. Right, but there may well be, you may be able to simulate desires, emotions, and so on. Okay, and so I'm thinking of offline belief here as a technical term, right? And I think, in English, we use a variety of terms to refer to offline beliefs, perhaps in Turkish as well. So imagine, suppose, pretend. And a very rough heuristic is that if someone imagines that P, then they offline believe that P. But I want to say that this is a very rough heuristic because I take it that, sometimes when we talk about someone imagining something, we're actually using that to talk about beliefs that she has or other offline mental states. So if I say, I imagine that John's at the pub right now, I'm telling you that I believe that John is at the pub right now. Right? I'm not telling you that I'm offline believing, basically. That's an online belief. Okay, and so I'm going to tell you a few things about how I think we should characterize offline belief. And the basic idea is to think about it in relationship to standard belief. Okay, so one key point of similarity between belief and offline belief is that they interact with the same inferential mechanisms that a subject uses to modify or revise her beliefs in light of some new information, right? So I tell you that there's going to be a marathon in London this weekend, and you believe me, you didn't think that before, and then you start to revise various other beliefs that you have in response to that, right? So you start to think, okay, well, there will be lots of traffic. Maybe it's not a good idea to visit museums this weekend, just so I can avoid all of that. And now compare that to someone asking you to suppose that there's a marathon in London this weekend, and then kind of filling in the details of that hypothetical scenario you construct in response. The claim here is that that thing you do to start off with is you form an offline belief that there's a marathon in London this weekend, and then you form various additional offline beliefs in response and filling in the details, and you're reusing the same inferential mechanisms as you did when you came to have this new belief about the marathon. Okay? And another key point of similarity is in its possible range of contents. And so the basic idea here is just that, well, if someone can believe that P, then they can also offline believe that P. Okay? And so if they can have a set of beliefs that includes two claims P and Q, then they can have a set of offline beliefs that includes P and Q. And so on the view of belief, I'm assuming in the background here, we take it that someone can believe contradictions, right? And so they can also offline believe, right? So they're going to be able to offline believe statements like Bob is a liar and Bob is not a liar. And then nevertheless, we want to be able to distinguish offline belief from belief in terms of its functional roles, right? And so, just think of it, there are different connections to action and assertion. So if I believe that there's a bear in the room, I will run and hide. if I offline believe that there's a bear in the room, I'm not going to run and hide, right? At most, I will pretend to run and hide, right? And likewise, you know, if I believe something, I might be apt to assert it, that there is a bear in the room, but I'm not going to do that on the basis of offline believing it, right? Okay, and so the way that I'm thinking about this is that this is a new term for something that has been posited before in the literature on folk psychology and pretense. So we see it especially in what get called simulationist theories of folk psychology, that is how we attribute mental states to other people. So, you know, one of the ideas there is that when I'm trying to figure out someone else's mental states, I'll put myself in their shoes, as it were, and one of the things that involves doing is trying to simulate that other person's beliefs, right? So I take on offline beliefs I believe them to have, and then I draw out the consequences of that using my offline belief capacities. But I don't think you need to be assuming a simulationist theory here as opposed to a theory to want to posit offline belief. Okay. And so earlier terms that we find in the literature for the same attitude, so here I was thinking of Curry and Ravenscroft. They have this account of recreative imagination, where that can be for various kinds of states, one of which is belief. Goldman talks about e-imagination of belief, for example. And Nichols and Stitch, in their book on mind reading, posit something they call possible world laws. Okay, so you might wonder, well, why posit offline belief? And I think that a lot of the motivation for it so far has been, well, we want to be able to explain how folk psychology and pretense are possible. Now, I think something that hasn't been given as much attention to in these debates as it should have is that, you know, you might think, well, the reason we have offline belief is not just, you know, so we can play games of pretends, and not even just to be able to, you know, attribute mental states to others, but also that we want to be able to explain the acquisition of beliefs and sometimes knowledge of all many kinds of sorts. Maybe they don't have to do with other people's mental states, right? So you might think that offline beliefs are the kinds of things that would have enhanced survival in creatures like us. So, you know, conditional statements are one such example, right? And that's what I'll be talking about. Okay. So among offline beliefs, I want to distinguish between two kinds of offline belief. And I'm going to call them inputs versus outputs. Okay. And so when, on a given occasion, we typically don't just form a single offline belief, but there's a whole sequence of offline beliefs that we form. So you can think of that as representing a hypothetical scenario, and I want to distinguish between the initial offline belief, which is typically voluntary, that you use to initiate the construction of the scenario. So I'm going to call that an offline belief input. And then I'm going to use the term offline belief outputs for the further offline beliefs we form in response. They're used to fill in the details of the scenario by reusing the inferential mechanisms I mentioned earlier, right? And those sorts of, when we form those offline beliefs, that's typically involuntary. Okay, so if you go back to the example with the and the offline belief input that there will be a marathon in London this weekend, then and then we fill in the details, things like there will be lots of traffic. That's the attitude towards that is one of an offline belief output, right? Okay. I think you kind of see something like this in Nichols and Stitch's account of mind reading. So they talk about what they call a pretense premise, and that functions very much like the offline belief input that I have here. And they also talk about states that are generated from the pretense premise by what they call inferential elaboration. And I'm going to call those offline belief outputs. And there are other sorts of offline beliefs here, potentially, where those are formed by a process of non-inferential elaboration. I'm not going to be talking about those today. Okay, so it might help to just visualize this process, or at least it does for me anyways. So you can kind of think of there as being these two boxes of a subject. On the right-hand side with the beliefs, I have statements that she believes. And then on the left-hand side, I have things that she offline believes on a given occasion. So we start out, we put down the input above the line, and then there are various things she kind of derives using these inferential mechanisms. And some of them will be claims that she believed already, some of them will not be, right? So, prior to being told that there will be a marathon in London this weekend, I believe that, say, it's a half-hour commute to Senate House from Paddington Station, and that's something that I will import, as it were, as an output when I'm thinking through, what will happen if there is a marathon in London this weekend. But other things are going to be, many of these offline belief outputs will be things that I don't believe. Okay, so what do we find in the Epistemology of Conditionals? So there hasn't really been that much work on this, but to the extent that there has been work on it, this is from Timothy Williamson's book, Philosophy of Philosophy, and then more recently some papers on conditionals. The process typically is described in terms of an imaginative exercise that is initiated by supposing to be, right? So the idea is that, and I really am just going to have to get a caricature of this account just for reasons of time. But the idea basically is that you evaluate an arbitrary conditional, if P then Q, by an imagining that is initiated by supposing that P. So first, you suppose that P, and then if you involuntarily imagine the consequent of the conditional, you'll come to believe the conditional. Now, by contrast, if you involuntarily imagine many propositions, none of which include Q, you may come to deny the conditional. Sometimes you might just not come to form a belief either way. And another idea he has here is that we often will use a heuristic. So if we involuntarily imagine the negation of the consequent, we'll actually deny the conditional altogether. So let me just give an example. So the idea is something like, okay, well, I'm trying to figure out if I go to this party, will I have a fun time or not? First, I'll suppose that I go to a party. I fill in the details, in my imagination, and if I do that in such a way that I imagine myself having a fun time, I'll come to believe that if I go to a party, I'll have fun time. And then the heuristic will allow me to deny the conditional if, when I suppose that I go to the party and I don't have a fun time, right? So, as it were, you might think that the negation that we have for the consequent can get moved outside for the conditional and allow us to deny the conditional altogether. Okay, and you might think, okay, well, so does this account? There's a really fundamental distinction in the literature on the semantics of conditionals that gets drawn between indicative and counterfactual or subjective conditionals. Can this account be made to work for both? I think that it is flexible enough for that, and that it. So let me say a bit about why we are going to want to say that the accounts are different for the two kinds of conditionals. So first of all, so there are cases where we have what you might think of as the same statement in the antecedent and the consequent, but the mood of the conditional changes, and intuitively so does the truth value. So So consider how someone, called her Jill, might evaluate these two conditionals. So if Oswald didn't kill Kennedy, then someone else did. So I want you all to, like, if you don't believe this already, you should trust me when I say that Oswald did assassinate Kennedy. And so when you do that, you're supposed to get this verdict that, okay, that's true. Actually, it's really true. Now, what about the counterfactual or subjective conditional? If Oswald hadn't killed Kennedy, then someone else would have. Well, that doesn't seem very, that seems like it's probably false, right? So you might think, well, him getting assassinated by Oswald was such an unlikely thing to happen, and that if he hadn't been killed by Oswald, he would have just died of natural causes or in some other way. So it looks like the process between, it has to differ in these two cases. And so we can accommodate that on this sort of, on Williamson's framework by just saying, well, there's the process by which what we involuntarily imagine given a supposition varies in one of two ways, right? There's something you do, call it indicative supposition, and that's different from counterfactual supposition. Okay. Now, what about, trying to formulate this kind of story using offline beliefs? So I think it's quite natural to use offline beliefs here, especially now that we have this distinction between inputs and outputs. So the idea is that you evaluate an arbitrary conditional, if P then Q, by a sequence of offline beliefs. And in that case, you start by forming the offline belief input in the antecedent, and then you you derive various offline belief outputs using these inferential mechanisms. And if you derive the consequent, you come to believe the conditional. And then once again, the same story for denying the conditional that Williamson has can be carried over here. So one heuristic that we use is that if you derive the offline belief output in the negation of the consequent from the input of the antecedent, then you deny the conditional. Okay, and so here we want to distinguish between two modes of forming offline belief, outputs from an input, right? So the idea is that in the Kennedy kind of case, we have the same input, that Oswald didn't kill Kennedy, but we derive outputs from it in one of two ways, just depending on whether we're evaluating an indicative or a counterfactual conditionals. Okay. And so I'm just going to call those two modes of the system working, the indicative and the subjective modes. Okay. And so again, you can kind of visualize the process using these sort of boxes, where you have, on the left-hand side here, just think of this P double arrow Q as just representing any kind of conditional. It could be indicative or subjunctive, and then I'm showing you how the process looks the same, but there's a difference between the mode. So if we have an indicative mode, input P to Q, output, we get the indicative conditional belief, and the subjunctive mode, we get a belief in that subjunctive or counterfactual. Okay. And then likewise for denying a conditional or believing it to be false, right? So you derive the output of not Q from the input P, and that allows you to outright deny the conditional. Okay. Okay, so so what I've just tried to do is just show how we can, both of the roles played by supposition and imagining on that sort of account can get played by offline beliefs. What about the epistemology of modality? So I'm really just going to be focused on metaphysical modality, but I think a lot of what I say carries over to a wide range of kinds of modal knowledge that we use in ordinary talk, like when I talk about whether I can run a mile in under 8 minutes or not. but that's just going to be too complicated to bring up. So I'm just going to talk about metaphysical mortality. And here we have two sorts of views in the literature that use imagination. So one is an extension of the earlier account I presented. This is Williamson's. I've tried to develop in my work as well, this counterfactual-based account of modal knowledge. And then there's also what you might think of as a Humean account of modal knowledge. And the idea there is that conceivability or imaginability is a kind of possibility. So let's consider the counterfactual account first. Here the basic idea is just that you evaluate modal claims by using the same process used to evaluate certain logically equivalent counterfactuals, right? And so here the relevant equivalence is just that it's impossible that P is equivalent to, if it were the case that P, then a truth functional contradiction, right? Something of the form P and not P would be the case. Okay, so then if you have the account that I mentioned earlier in terms of supposition imagination, the view will just be that you evaluate whether P is impossible by first supposing that P, and then involuntarily imagining various claims given that supposition, right? So if you involuntarily imagine a contradiction, then you come to believe that P is impossible. And then by contrast, if you fail to involuntarily imagine a contradiction after repeated attempts, you may come to believe P to be possible, right? And sometimes we're lucky enough that that belief constitutes knowledge. Okay. And so the variant here that uses offline belief, the idea is really, well, we just use the offline belief system operating in the subjective mode, right? Because these modal claims are logically equivalent to these counterfactual conditionals, and we just use the same mechanisms that we have for evaluating counterfactuals. So we really just plug in the earlier account of counterfactual knowledge I sketched earlier and apply it to the modal claims that are equivalent. Right? So you evaluate whether a proposition is impossible by deriving offline belief outputs from the input that the proposition is true in the subjective mode. Right? And if you reach a contradiction as an offline belief output, you come to believe that it's impossible. By contrast, if you fail to form an output in a contradiction, then you may think that it's possible, and that's the end. And so here's the story in the case of a belief in impossibility. So the idea is, okay, here on the left-hand side I'm showing you, well, you come to believe this strange counterfactual on the left-hand side when you derive a contradiction from P as an offline belief output, right? And the idea is that you use that very same process to sometimes form beliefs in impossibility. Second sort of account is the Humean account. And the idea here is just that you can come to know that P is possible by imagining P, right? And then there are all kinds of restrictions that are put on, you know, in what circumstances that process gives you knowledge or not, right? And sometimes these views are just stated in terms of justification, right? So I think this sort of view has been is one way of trying to spell out the sort of slogan that people call Hume's maxim, conceivability or imaginability as a guide for possibility. Okay, so how can we do this in terms of offline belief? That might seem less clear. Now, one thing, I think this is there's a kind of mode of reasoning that we seem to use, and in general you might think that there is this special connection between possibility, not just metaphysical possibility actually, but even other kinds of possibility. But here I'll just focus on metaphysical, that when say I think some counterfactual conditional is true, and I also believe the antecedent to be possible, then I should also think that the consequent is possible. Okay, so let me just give you an example. I think that if I were to go out into the hallway, I would get a cup of coffee during the break. I think that it's possible for me to go out in the hallway but I should also think that it's possible for me to go out and get a cup of coffee during the break, right? I think we kind of, and I'm not going to argue for this here, but this is a really intuitive way of reasoning. Now, so what I want to say here is that take someone who knows that the antecedent of the conditional is possible. Now, she uses the process for forming a belief in the certain counterfactual. So she derives the output that P from the input that Q. And she knows that the antecedent Q is possible. Now, my claim here is just that, if her offline belief system is working well, not only can she come to know the counterfactual, but she can also come to know that the consequent of the conditional is possible too. And so this actually gives us a way of capturing the Humean idea. So the idea is that, well, the person here can know that P is metaphysically possible by offline believing that P is in these circumstances. Okay, and so again, visualizing the process, we have on the left-hand side the process that you use for coming to believe a counterfactual. And now when you know the antecedent is possible as well, you can use it to come to believe the consequent is also possible. Sometimes that's knowledge. Right? Okay. And so now just in the final bit of the talk, I want to say something about why should we prefer the sort of account that uses offline belief to the one that is framed in terms of imagination and supposition. I mean, so just very crudely, you might think, well, we have these two approaches. One looks, what you might think of as folk psychological, using these terms that we all use, supposition and imagination. And then this more cognitive scientific approach, which uses the idea of mental simulation and especially offline belief. Why should we prefer the latter? I just want to say something first that I want to disavow any sort of eliminativist motivation. So you might think, oh, well, maybe our ordinary terms like imagination and belief are just garbage. We realize as we kind of develop a more mature science of the mind, and we shouldn't think there are any such things at all. I don't think that that's, I think that's far too extreme. The motivations I have in mind here are much more specific, and they're limited to supposition and imagination in theorizing about knowledge and conditionals of modality. So I want to talk about three advantages here. First, I just want the point about continuity. So there's continuity with earlier work on folk psychology and mind reading and pretense. And we can see clearly from this sort of account that the very same mental state features in the evaluation of conditionals and modal claims, as does in children's schemes of pretense, appreciation of fiction, and folk psychology. And indeed, when sometimes in passing, authors like Nichols and Stitch have suggested that the original function of the state that I'm calling offline belief is to think about conditionals. We can kind of see how that is on this sort of account. Second, it's more informative, right? So the theory tells us more about what the mechanisms are underlying the process of evaluating conditional modal claims, right? So we reuse the same inferential mechanisms used in belief updating, and these mechanisms can be reused in one of two ways, indicative or subjunctive. Obviously there's a lot more that can be said about how those processes work, and I haven't done that today. Whereas on the other sort of account, we get that, okay, well, sometimes you involuntarily imagine things given a supposition, and it's left quite mysterious how that process works. And third, and I think maybe this is the most important consideration, is it allows us to avoid really difficult questions like the ones I started with at the beginning of the talk about the nature of imagination and its relationship to supposition. Right? So all of these claims, these issues about, for example, what is the range of propositions that we're able to imagine, have been highly controversial, and it's hard to know how to settle those issues, right? So if you want something like Williamson's view to be right, you're going to have to think that you can imagine truth functional contradictions, whereas many have thought that we're not able to do that. We're only able to suppose those sorts of contents. Yeah. And so, you might ask, I think a very natural response to have here is, well, maybe we can reconcile the sort of accounts. Maybe one of the supposition imagination accounts you mentioned is correct, as is the offline belief account, and these are really just two ways of saying the same thing. And then we can have both. Wouldn't that be great? But I think in order to really do that, this requires us to answer the difficult questions that I think we should try to avoid if we can, right? So how do the reference of our term supposition and imagination line up with offline beliefs and other offline mental states, other aspects of our mental life? This is a really difficult question, and I think if we can avoid having to answer them, that would be very nice. And we can avoid doing that if we just move to theorizing in terms of this technical term. Okay. So, of course you can stipulate new uses of the term for suppose and imagine, but I don't really see much advantage in doing that, right? It's only going to create confusion. So I think it's better to just leave aside supposition and imagination when we're theorizing about these domains. Okay, now I'll just start to wrap up. Okay, great. So here I've only focused on metaphysical modality. I think it can be extended to what I called in other work objective modalities. And I've only focused on the roles of supposition and imagination, but I think what I say can be extended to the theoretical roles of conceivability in the epistemology of modality. Okay, so just to summarize what I'm trying to do here, I've explained how imagination is traditionally contrasted with supposition. Their roles in epistemology look very different, but nevertheless both roles can and should be played by a single attitude, offline belief. Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Now, Ishwan Aranyoshi from Bilkent Philosophy will give a short response.
Okay, so my reply is really has to do with the very last
This is a me.
so it really has to do with the very last slide, which is, the last slide where Margot mentions the possibility of reconciling what she calls reconciling the two views. So here is an alternative world. It's a famous song called Suppose. Suppose no possessions. I wonder if you can, only for greed or hunger, brotherhood of man. Suppose all the people are sharing all the world. Very beautiful lyrics, but not as beautiful, right, as the original. But I didn't only put it here because, for fun. But if you notice the second line, I think is, problematic in the sense, why would you say, I wonder if you can? Whereas with imagination, you could say, yeah, I can ask. I wonder if you can imagine. So here is so I take this as a datum. That suppose that P is not the same as imagine that P. That is a slide from 2 days ago. I'm teaching Introduction to Logic. I have some students here. So we learned conditional proof and reductio ad absurdum. And that's what you do. You tell them, assume P. And no one has a problem. No one ever says, oh, I'm trying to assume, but I can't, right? And I think with imagination, so I think, there's a lot of differences. So I take this as a datum, at least as a kind of very intuitive idea that they look to be distinct and fundamental. So I was kind of expecting when I started reading Margot's paper that, it would be nice if she found something that's more fundamental, so that we get rid of this illusion of this dualistic illusion of the fundamentality of supposition and imagination. But unfortunately, I couldn't find that. So here's a quote from Williamson in 2016 from a book edited by Amy Kind, who's here. So it's the distinction between voluntary and involuntary imagination, which Margot mentioned in the talk. So it's a quote, when the hunter makes himself imagine trying to jump a stream, his imagination operates in voluntary mode. But he neither makes himself imagine succeeding, nor makes himself imagine failing. Rather, having forced the initial conditions, he lets the rest of the imaginative exercise unfold without further interference. For that remainder, his imagination operates in involuntary mode. He imagines the antecedent of the conditional voluntarily, the consequent involuntarily. Left to itself, the imagination develops the scenario in a reality-oriented way by default. Right? So it's a very nice, a very intuitive distinction. Of course, there are several problems with it. My problem with it is that, again, it looks to me that we have two fundamental things. And now, Williamson starts calling them imagination, right? Instead of just calling them, one is supposition, and the other one is imagination. But I said, okay, you can do that, but you are not really reducing anything to anything. You still have two fundamental things. Now you call it voluntary, involuntary, right? Voluntary imagination is really supposition. What you ask students in the logic course to do. So my problem with Margot's paper is I don't really see something new and exciting on top of Williamson's account. So here's, I compared the two basic, the main picture from her paper, and you have input and output in the outline belief, and you have what she calls imports from the belief that the person already has. In Williamson, you have for input, that's the episode of voluntary imagination, and that's up to you, and it's very easy to do. You can imagine anything, basically, in that sense of imagination. And then you have the involuntary imagination, which is what happens when you let your imagination unfold and see what follows from whatever you assume, right? And of course, that can get inputs from background beliefs. So, because Williamson is interested in knowledge, and the way in which your background knowledge and background beliefs, still influence your ways of evaluating scenarios like that. Okay. Now, Margot is aware of that, so I'm not making this up. Okay. She says, at this point, one might ask whether we might reconcile supposition imagination theories with the offline belief theory. Perhaps supposition is the same thing as the attitude that called offline belief input, which I think it is, and perhaps imagination, or a kind of imagination, is offline belief. Then the offline belief theory really just tells us something about how these four psychological posits of supposition and imagination line up with the more cognitive scientific posit of offline belief. I mean, in the paper itself, you can call it more cognitive scientific, but it's not very cognitive scientific. To me, it still looks like you just draw some boxes, and that's I have a problem with that. So there's the last. So now she replies saying, I think we should resist trying to reconcile the theories by saying how supposition and imagination relate to offline belief. And she says it's very hard to know what the terms suppose and imagine refer. So one reply I have is, all we need to accept is that it's very intuitive that they are distinct, right? I'm not saying that we should accept that they are really distinct and fundamental, but the way, if you want to prove that they are really, ultimately they are grounded in something else, I think you don't do like armchair metaphysics or conditionals. You do like real, empirical cognitive neuroscience. So that's reply 2. In this particular case, if you indeed find a mechanism and you say, okay, here is empirical evidence that basically what we thought is two fundamentally distinct things, actually they are based in the same brain mechanism, then everyone will say, oh, okay, that's a really powerful argument. An example is episodic memory and episodic imagination. Kirk has been working on that in the last years, and there's a lot of neuroscience evidence. And of course, you can disagree that it's really, it proves anything, but at least I think it's much better than the armchair kind of thing that Williamson does and you do. So basically, that's my thanks for.